Breadbox Media programming is brought to you by Celebrate our God-given freedom and faith while honoring our Blessed Mother with Ghirelli's USA Rosary. Each state is represented on this rosary's 50 beads. Red, white, and blue enamel adorn its patriotic crucifix. Get yours today. Shop www.GHIRELLI.com. Introducing the redesigned CatholicSingles.com, featuring new ways that put the spotlight on the person and their faith, not just a profile picture. For the past 20 years, faithful Catholics have used CatholicSingles.com, and the reimagined CatholicSingles.com website is ready to help single Catholics take the next step in sharing meaningful relationships with other faithful Catholics. Remember, CatholicSingles.com for faith, fellowship, and love.
And welcome back to this week's episode of Lisa, Hendey and Friends. I am so excited because on the podcast this week we have someone who has been to me a great source of inspiration, a mentor in my own personal writing. We share a deep love for the saints and for story. And with us today on the podcast is Colleen Carroll Campbell. Colleen, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Lisa.
What an honor. And just for those of you who have never encountered Colleen's work, where have you been? But I'll share a little bit of her official bio with you. She is an award-winning author, journalist, and former presidential speechwriter. Many of us know her book, My Sister's the Saints, which has a great place of honor on my bookshelf. We've seen her all over radio and television, including at AWTN, where she hosted her own shows for 8 years, and she and her family live in St. Louis. She's homeschooling 4 beautiful children and lives there with her husband, John. And we're here today to talk about this brand new book, The Heart of Perfection. Colleen, I always like to start out with asking my guests to tell us a little bit more about your story, just how you've gotten to this point in your spiritual journey. And without diving too much into the course of the book, just let us know a little bit about your story.
Sure. And first, Lisa, I have to say that you're a celebrity in my house. When my kids heard I was doing an interview with the author of The Chime Travelers, they're big fans. So that tops the other interviews I had done to date. So I just wanted to let you know that. So, yes, my story is, and The Heart of Perfection interweaves my own story with that of these 7 recovering perfectionist saints, I call them, and 1 heretic. And basically, I didn't think perfectionism was a problem for me, so I never envisioned myself writing a book about this. I thought people who were perfectionists had squeaky clean kitchens and alphabetized their CDs, things like that. And since I wasn't that type of person, I thought it wasn't a problem. But when I became a mother 9 years ago, I began to see that this drivenness that I had, these sometimes unrealistic expectations and this desire for flawlessness for myself that I had carried into my work and into other parts of my life where I thought it was serving me well, was going to be a real problem in motherhood, because, life with kids and life in relationship, life in the real world doesn't always follow our timelines, our expectations, and even my own expectations of myself as a mother and as a Christian. I just felt kind of overwhelmed by the sense that I was constantly falling short. And when I began to unpack that, I found that the root of that, like I think the root of a lot of the perfectionism we see in our culture, was lies I had believed about who I had to be to earn God's love, to work my way to heaven. And I knew better than to say these things out loud, but I was living like I believed that God's love could be earned and needed to be earned. And when I began to unpack that, I realized that the deeper problem, I think, in our culture with perfectionism is this spiritual perfectionism. And it's not a new problem. It's one we can learn a lot from the saints about because they struggled with it too.
Yeah, the book is so compelling. I mean, you have very much a teaching message here, but I love it so much because it's surrounded by your story and the stories of others, and we come to know you in a way that maybe will be surprising to some, friends who think that they've seen Colleen on television and they've read, your former work, and you've had a very public life, and so was it a little scary to open yourself up so vulnerably to this topic?
Yeah, it was. And, I had done that with my Sisters the Saints, sort of reluctantly. I kind of backed into writing a memoir because I kept finding every other way I wanted to tell the story. I couldn't do it in a way that was compelling unless I shared how I had struggled myself. But this book was even deeper, I guess you would say, The Heart of Perfection, because I was looking at parts of myself that I had never looked at before. And in studying the lives of these saints, I was really learning in real time from them, and then reflecting back on my own life and saying, wow, that's a struggle for me too, and one I hadn't even noticed. So I do think that The Heart of Perfection sort of takes it a level deeper than my Sisters the Saints, and I'm very proud of the previous work. It was a blessing to be able to write, but I do think as we try to grow closer to the Lord and grow in our relationships with Him and with others, we do start to see parts of ourselves and our lives and our spirituality that need some work that we didn't maybe notice before. And I think that was a lot of this journey for me. And so, yes, it was in some ways a very, I had to be very vulnerable in the book. But as with my Sisters the Saints, I found there was no other way to tell the truth about this struggle and the truth of God's love unless I admitted the places in my life where I needed that truth and I needed to live it more fully.
The opening chapters point to some episodes that happened, early in your life as a mom, sort of your breaking point. How were you journaling at that time, or how did you find yourself? Because this has been a few years back now. How did you find yourself so able to kind of transport us so emotionally to those moments?
Well, I am a journaler, so I do tend to write a lot, and that's one really important method of prayer for me. But some of these were just experiences that were seared in my memory, and I think every mom probably has these, right? And it's our mistakes. I can forget what I did right, but I never forget what I did wrong. And so one of these in particular that I describe in the first chapter of The Heart of Perfection was, on my way into an ER with a child, and an accident that, yes, could have happened to anyone, but, I was really blaming myself, and I was somewhat at fault in the sense that I was trying to do too much, and I think I could have prevented this accident had I not been kind of trying to play the supermom role. But it was in that moment, I really do remember it very clearly, because it was the first time in my life where that critical voice I'd carried around all my life, that I think many of us carry around inside our heads, was the first time that I talked back to it. And even more accurately, that the Lord talked back to that voice. I always thought maybe that was His voice, accusing me, condemning me, judging me. And for the first time, I got a little distance in the midst of a diatribe against myself. And so, wait a minute, whose voice is that? And that doesn't sound like the voice of the Lord, who sent His only Son to die for me, who loved me into being, who sustains me with His every breath. That God is for me, not against. And to hear His voice sort of break through the noise in my head of condemnation, that was the first time that I thought, not only do I have a problem with perfectionism, but I've been getting this wrong. I've been thinking God is the one with the whip driving me, and I don't think it's really Him. And that began this journey where I started to see that the true path to gospel perfection, which is what Jesus calls us to, it's not to lower our standards, but rather to change our goals. It's a whole different way than the way I had thought I needed to travel to get closer to God. And it's so much more about surrender than about striving.
I sometimes find in my own moments where I have those, moments of perfectionism where I'm beating myself up, that I imagine myself saying the words in my head that I'm speaking to myself out loud as if I were saying them to one of my children. Right. And then if we really do believe God as a loving Father, as our Creator, being a parent gives you the insight that those are words that you would never say aloud to someone that you love. Why we say them to ourselves can be such a crazy burden. I want to hear a little bit about kind of the difference in your mind between spiritual perfectionism and scrupulosity, because that's a word that, we associate quite frequently with piety and with the saints, but is there a difference between the two?
Well, I think scrupulosity is an outgrowth or a manifestation of what I call spiritual perfectionism. So the saints, didn't call themselves perfectionists, although it's interesting. Once in a while you see this term. Francis de Sales called Jane de Chantal a perfectionist early in their communication together. So it wasn't a completely foreign term to some of them. But in general, the saints, when they're talking about anxieties, discouragement, and scrupulosity, they're often talking about this constellation of issues that I sort of use the umbrella term of spiritual perfectionism to describe. And scrupulosity is a very specific outgrowth. It's been called religious OCD in a sense. It's that obsessing over minor faults, small sins, sometimes imaginary sins, sometimes merely fleeting thoughts. Alphonsus Liguori struggled mightily with scruples, and his main issue was bad thoughts that would pop in his head that he didn't even want, but he thought he was responsible for them. It was his fault. What's wrong with me that I'm not thinking, perfectly every day? And so this isn't always an issue for people who struggle with spiritual perfectionism, but it is, I think, increasingly an issue today. And it was interesting, Cardinal O'Connor later in his life gave a homily once and wrote a bit about scrupulosity and how he was seeing more of it in our culture today. As the culture gets crazier, he said, faithful Christians, faithful Catholics often feel they got to run into the other direction and do everything perfectly and beat themselves up over any tiny fault because that's the only way they're going to stay safe from the craziness of the culture. And we can really get into a serious dangerous place that way spiritually, because I think we sense that, okay, well, things are going to one extreme, I'm going to go to the other. But as so many of the recovering perfectionist saints found, many of them struggled with scruples in one form or another. That's not a fast track to holiness. It's a detour, a dangerous one. And it's one in which we set ourselves up as the judge of ourselves and reject God's mercy. And it's really motivated by a secret pride, a sense of I should be able to be flawless on my own. I shouldn't need mercy. I shouldn't need grace to help me. I shouldn't be weak. I shouldn't make mistakes. And Jesus came and accepted weakness for our sakes. The least we can do is accept it for ourselves. Yes, we're not going to be sinless as he is, and yes, we need to strive for holiness, but we need to be very careful of giving in to those voices of condemnation and judgment that sort of run like a loop in many of our minds, because it's not the voice of God. And so often scrupulous people, when they're focused on those spiritual pet peeves, they're missing the much bigger issues God is trying to bring to their attention, the much bigger and more important faults that he does want them to look at and own and confess and work on.
I wonder, with the increasing access that we all have to Catholic media, and especially to social media, if there is a temptation towards spiritual perfectionism that comes from the sort of, I hate to call it voyeuristic, but the fact that we can look at those we admire, whether they're well-known Catholics or just people in our social circles that we admire, and tend to compare ourselves. So how do you use kind of Catholic social media in a healthy way that doesn't lend towards increase of spiritual perfectionism?
Well, that's a great question, Lisa, and it's interesting how often I've been getting that question in introducing the Heart of Perfection. So I think social media is certainly playing a role in all of this. I mean, we know there was a study out recently that millennials are the most perfectionist generation in history, and I don't think it's a coincidence they're also the guinea pig generation for social media, and spending so much of our lives online, looking at other people's lives online, and then comparing our insides to their outsides. So I think comparison is a big part of the perfectionist trap, and I think in terms of combating that, one of the best lessons we can learn is from the heretic that I profile in The Heart of Perfection, Angelique Arnault. She was known as the mistress of Jansenism. Most people have forgotten her today, but in her day, she was seen as a leading reformer in the French church, and then she kind of went off the deep end of Jansenism, this very dour, elitist view of God that led her and so many who followed her into heresy, basically dying at war with the church. But one thing I learned from looking at her life and her refusal to recover from perfectionism, even though she had Francis de Sales for a time as a spiritual director, so just goes to show, it has to be heart knowledge, not just head knowledge, is that she lost her joy. And I think when we see ourselves losing our joy, whether it's spending too much time online, too much time on social media, too much time comparing ourselves to others, too much time lamenting why we can't be as holy as the next guy. I think when we see that loss of joy, that can be a really important alarm bell that says, okay, you're headed in the wrong direction. Scripture tells us the joy of the Lord is your strength. And that means we're weak, vulnerable to sin, error, and attack when we forfeit our spiritual joy. It doesn't mean we're going to be happy all the time, but I think we do have to be very careful to admit our weakness and say there are some people, situations, and habits that I need to get distance from if I don't want to see my joy leached away and see myself led into sin. And I think a lot of recovering from perfectionism is that awareness that there are certain situations I just can't be in very much because they lead to this compulsive comparison and this perfectionist compulsion. And I want to get away from that. And I'm going to focus less on my faults and those of the world and the church and others around me, and more on God's glory and his infinite love.
Absolutely beautiful. I'm glad you brought up Angelique Arnault. That was one of the stories that I wanted to ask you about. And we know and love you so much for your love for the saints and how you lead us into closer relationship with them. Did you revisit, some of the saints that you've written about in the past, but how was it to kind of look at their lives and their stories through this prism of perfectionism, and how did you kind of revisit them as you were writing this book?
Well, it was interesting. I wrote a lot about the saints. My sister's the saints, a whole book dedicated to the saints. So I'd always loved the saints. But when this problem first came to my attention early on in my motherhood, I started to dodge the writings and lives of the saints for a time. I was still giving speeches about my sisters, the saints. I was still praying for their intercession. I mean, I believed as much as ever in their support and friendship, but I was starting to dodge their writings and life stories because I thought I knew what was there, and I was pretty sure that spiritual overachievers were the last people I needed to look to if I wanted to get over this, this compare and despair cycle. But when I began looking again at some of these saints, I saw some very new things that I had missed the first time around. A great example of this would be Therese.
Yes.
Her little way is beautiful, and I wrote a lot about it in My Sisters the Saints, how her own father's journey through dementia helped me dealing with my father's journey through Alzheimer's disease. So I love Therese, and I kind of thought I got Therese, but all of her charity, so many ways what seemed to me this perfect charity to these super cranky nuns and the people being terrible to her, and just this smiling face and I'm going to do everything with love for Jesus. It kind of overwhelmed me when I was looking more and more at my failures of patience and charity and gentleness and all the rest. And I thought, oh boy, I just can't go there. When I looked back at Therese, and one author who helped me do this a lot is Brother Joseph Schmidt. He writes some beautiful books about Saint Therese, and specifically her struggle with scrupulosity, hypersensitivity, people-pleasing, spiritual perfectionism, in other words. And I began to see how Therese was also a recovering perfectionist, and it was only when she began to fully accept God's mercy for her, his love for her, in her weakness, not once she prettied herself up and wore her good girl dress, but in her weakness, in her mess, that's when you begin to see the fruit in her life, where she's able to lead these other novices out of this self-hatred cycle and into God's love and his grace, where she's able to show more grace to others, to smile and pray for the nun who sits there smirking at her on her deathbed, to be sweet when she's, doing laundry next to someone who splashes dirty water on her with every dunk and rinse, to hang out with the crankiest nun in the convent and genuinely find God's love in this woman. And she's able to do that not because she beats herself up and punishes herself for every fall. She went through that period. And when she lets that go, when she begins to see that it's not on her own strength, it's not even her own heart that's going to love others, it's Jesus' heart in her, that's when you begin to see the little way come to fruition and that holiness that we know her for begin to blossom. And for me, that was important to realize that the canon of saints is not just filled with ex-murderers like Paul and ex-playboys like Augustine. It's also filled with ex-people pleasers and former workaholics and survivors of religious OCD and reformed social climbers. It's filled with people who have struggled with some of the same things that many of us perfectionists struggle with, and that gave me hope.
The technology is different, but the themes recur. You have these spiritual friendships and spiritual mentors and the saints, but you also have relationships in your real life. And I wonder if you might say a few words about how I think part of owning up to any struggle is letting the people who are close to us know that these are issues in our lives. And so was it challenging for you as a wife, as a friend to people, to let people into this? When you get ready to share a book, you're going to be letting the world know, but how was it for you to seek some support from the people closest to you, and how have they been a consolation to you in this journey?
Yes, well, I think that is, as we talked about before, you do have to make yourself vulnerable. And I think if you're going to share anything that actually helps anybody, you got to kind of put yourself out there. Maybe not every last detail, but at least sharing kind of from the heart. So, yes, this was an ongoing struggle for me, and it was in my motherhood that I came to grips with it. And so my husband John has been my best supporter all the way along in everything I've done, and certainly in this journey as well. And he's always been the one encouraging me to share openly, even where I struggle, and he's always been a support to me in that. And, we joke about my perfectionism, and it's still ongoing. I never hold myself up as a model of, I've got it all figured out, now let me write a book to tell you how to figure it out. That's why I think the saints are so valuable. They've actually run the race and finished well. Me, I'm still on the journey very much. And my husband and children have been my greatest support because, their love, obviously their prayers, but also, they shine a mirror to you, especially my children. I mean, I homeschool my children, but I'll tell you, they school me every day.
Oh, yes.
And I've learned so much about myself and about God and about his unconditional love, as you mentioned before, that becoming a parent has been a huge piece of this for me because, as you said, I look at my children and with all my faults, I could never imagine treating them with such judgment and condemnation as I sometimes heap down on myself. And, when I can pipe up with all sorts of wonderful phrases to them, that's one thing. But the challenge of having children is I have to live this for them every day, because if I don't live like God's mercy is real, then they're going to grow up and think it's not. And perfectionism runs in family. That's one thing I came across in all of the research.
It's actually,
and
one thing that I wanted to say about that topic of children too is that one thing that can happen as a parent is that we begin to judge not only our own the quality of our own spiritual relationship with God, but to hold ourselves responsible for that of our family members as well. And so, some people may struggle with perfectionist tendencies in their own life, but also that can spill over into the way that we are forming our children in the faith. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the research has shown that, and the researchers, debate, is this nature or nurture? Are perfectionists born or made? But really, it's probably a mix of both. But it does run in families. And part of the heart of perfection was looking back at my own family. My mom cops to being a perfectionist. Her mom was a grade A perfectionist, 12 children, president of every Catholic and arts organization in her hometown, baked her own whole wheat bread in the Wonder Bread days. And, she was making a hot homemade lunch every afternoon because she didn't think the parochial school fare was up to par, and taking in foster children and stray bunnies and, you name it. She was amazing, but it was hard on her, and it was hard on her family. And I think it's important that we do look back through our family tree and recognize that we love these people. They shaped us, and at the same time, we can learn from their struggles. And we want to learn, I think, in front of our children. I mean, there's one family I read about, and the way they deal with this is every night at dinner, they go around the table, and instead of talking about their successes, they pick one mistake they made and what they learned from it. And mom and dad do this too. And I think it's a great idea, and it's made me more aware of sharing with my children, not just let me tell you the time I won first place and everything went great, but let me tell you the time I struggled and what I learned from that. I don't think this is about these, adult confessions to little kids who don't need to hear all the details. But I think it is important to be real with our children and to apologize to our children when we mess up. Even when we're apologizing to a pint-sized kid who comes up to our knee and saying, I'm sorry, that was a little too harsh, or I was wrong there. I think that's, there's some fear, I think, as parents that we need to be the ultimate authority. Well, we do need to be authority figures. We do need to be parents, but God is the only perfect one. And I think it's okay for our children to see that we accept our weakness and then we forgive ourselves and we accept God's mercy, because that's the way they're going to learn to do it. If we talk mercy to them, but we don't live it ourselves, all they're going to learn is from what they see, not what they hear.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. And one of the great blessings of a relationship with adult kids, mine are older now, is the ability in those moments to ask them, will you pray for me? This is an area of struggle for me. And to help them to see that that they can be a consolation to us when we struggle.
Yeah.
And they don't have to be older for us to do that. We can ask that of a 7-year-old who's just received her first communion. You love Jesus so much. Can you talk with him and ask him to be with me? It's a beautiful, sometimes fragile place to be, but and as you said, doing it in an age appropriate fashion is significant and important. But I think we need to help them to realize that they minister to us in those moments as well. So, well, Colleen, I could keep you all day, but I know you're so busy. So I want to just ask you, so The Heart of Perfection is the name of this book, How the Saints Taught Me to Trade My Dream of Perfect for God's. And it's available at your local Catholic bookstore, through your publisher. We'll have links in our show notes. But are there any kind of closing thoughts or words of encouragement that you'd like to give to our listeners about their own journey towards overcoming spiritual perfectionism?
Well, I think maybe the only thing I didn't mention, but I think is important, is just as we hear so much about perfectionism in our culture, we do often hear that the solution is to lower our standards, kind of squelch our idealism, let it go. And I think it's important to remember that as Christians, we don't have to do that. That longing that we feel deep inside us for what's perfect, for holiness, that's a longing for God. And God put it there, and that longing will be fulfilled someday in heaven. But this isn't our heaven here. The here is where we're on the journey. So I think it's important to remember that we don't have to squelch those desires for what is perfect and holy and beautiful. We simply have to turn them over every day, every hour to Jesus and ask him to purify them and redirect our hearts so that we can follow his dream for our lives. And if we really believe in the promise of heaven, as St. Paul says, eye has not seen, ear has not heard, nor has it entered into the heart of man what God has ready for those who love him. If we really believe that, then we don't have anything to fear for trading our dreams of perfect for God's or our plans for God's. So I think he has great things in store for each one of us, and it's really just comes back down to surrender.
Oh, how beautiful. That's a great place to turn you back toward the heart of perfection. Make sure you get a hold of this book. It's absolutely fantastic. Colleen, if folks want to kind of keep up with your work, is there a good kind of central place for them to come and follow you?
Yes, Colleen-Campbell.com is my website. I'm also on Facebook, and they can find me there, but the website's probably the best place to connect.
Fantastic. We'll have that link in our show notes, as well as a link for you to get your hands on The Heart of Perfection. Colleen, thank you so much for sharing your heart, for sharing your story, and for leading us ever closer into God's embrace.
Thank you, Lisa. I appreciate you having me.
And give those little chime travelers a fist bump for me, too.
I will.
Well, friends, that is it for this week's podcast. Again, I want to point you to this great book, The Heart of Perfection. Visit lisahendey.com for our full show notes, including the links to Colleen's website and ways for you to get in touch with this book. If you enjoy the podcast, you can always support it by leaving a star rating or review wherever you listen to podcasts. And definitely, I would love to carry your prayer intentions and just to be in conversation with you. You can always reach me by email at lisa@catholicmom.com or on social media at Lisa. I hope you have an awesome week, and we'll see you next time. God bless.
Father Dwight Longenecker. I'd like to invite you to join me for a pilgrimage tour to France this September. It's based on my book, St. Benedict and St. Therese, The Little Rule and the Little Way. I'll be teaching about the spiritualities and the lives of these two great saints, and we'll be visiting the great monastery of Fleury, where St. Benedict's relics are venerated, and of course going to Lisieux to visit the childhood home of St. Therese, the Carmel where she was a nun, and the great basilica dedicated to her honor. But there's more than that. At Paris, we'll be visiting the Basilica of Sacré-Cœur, Rue de Bac with the Miraculous Medal, going on to Vézelay, Nevers with St. Bernadette, Paris-le-Monial, where the devotion to the Sacred Heart of Jesus was given to St. Margaret Mary, and then Chartres Cathedral, Mont Saint-Michel, the Normandy beaches, and more. I think there's not only going to be time for instruction and learning, but also prayer and worship, celebrating Mass in the various locations, and also time for fellowship and a good bit of French food and wine, too. Come and join us this September. If you'd like to know more, go to CatholicHeritageTours.com. That's CatholicHeritageTours.com, or be in touch with me through my website, DwightLongenecker.com.
Breadbox Media programming is brought to you by Jack Kane Ford. Find your next Ford Tough vehicle at caneford.com.